Hello, everybody, and welcome to Positive Fandom. I am your host, Mmmm, and today we have with us Darth Plato. How are you today?
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be on. It's a nice morning where I am. I hope everyone's having a good morning. Good morning, whoever may be here right now.
Yes. Well, Darth Plato, thank you for joining me again here. Of course, have been covering this fantastic series, Horatio Hornblower. And last week we wrapped up our third and final part of our review for Napoleon Bonaparte and Josephine, a love story, which was an amazing series to review. I did enjoy that very much, and I'm glad you had suggested it. And now we're back on to another episode of Horatio Hornblower. And Horatio Hornblower, um, we did do the first episode maybe almost a month ago or so, of Horatio Hornblower, where he finally gets his assignment of where he's going to go, at least for that point when he first starts off
The
as,
duel. Yeah.
yes, the duel as a sailor and hence officer in the fleet. And now we're finding that he's already going to have this examination to become a lieutenant, and it is a big deal. And it is very interesting because, um, I've always known that officers have to take exams. I wasn't quite sure whether everybody had to take an exam, whether you were an officer or not, in order to get a promotion of some kind. But certainly officers have to take these examinations. And I thought to myself, gee, what is an examination like in that time period? Because that's, ages ago. What would
Sure.
that entail? And so there's this so much anticipation for Horatio and having to take this examination so
Yeah.
he can become a lieutenant. So if he's not a lieutenant now, is he just what is his title? Do we know?
I believe he's just a midshipman or
So
acting midshipman. He's an acting lieutenant.
Okay, so he's an acting lieutenant, and
Yeah.
he's been doing this for a while. I'm guessing maybe I don't know the exact amount of time he's been on the ship, but I'm guessing he's been on the ship for
He's been there for a few years. Well, the first episode they showed him going aboard one of the ships, whatever the name of the ship was, or the Chimera, I think is what it was. The indefatigable
mhm.
is with the ship he's currently on. That was in 1793. So this is the episode we're watching is 1796. So he's been on there for 3 years.
Yes, and it's very interesting that he has the situation where he finds himself on the ship. Things seem to be going okay, but as you and I both know, things can change from one minute to the next when it comes
Mm.
to being on the ship. And he kind of,
Wow, I don't know anything about being on a ship, so that's one of the things about the series that's interesting.
well, yeah, yeah, it is very interesting. And it seems like, things can change from one day to the next. Maybe that's a easier way to put it. Um, and of course, Horatio finds himself in this position time and time again where he has to deal with what's going on with his ship. And there's all sorts of things he has to deal with. At first, what we see is a situation where everybody is on the ship, and unfortunately there isn't enough supplies, which I'm sure happened quite often, depending upon where you could end up at any time. You could find yourself out to sea for months and months.
Well, yes,
And
but there's an extenuating circumstance for why that is here, though. Well, life at sea can be unexpected. That's true, but there's also a war going on.
yes, and of course, when that happens, things like supply ships don't exactly arrive when planned. And so we see that is the case here in this particular circumstance for Horatio on the Indefatigable, with the captain, who he seems to have become very close to over these years that he's there. And it seems like it's a good working relationship, although I'm not quite sure whether or not he is always going to agree with the captain. And of course, stuff like that tends to happen after you've been on a ship for a while. there may be things that you agree or disagree with your captain, and as an officer, this shouldn't be a surprise. Officers will often give their opinion to the captain and say whether or not they think something, or suggest another way to go.
or
And so,
especially
Horatio, I'm sorry, go ahead.
especially in the English system, more so than in the American system.
Hmm. And so, yeah, we're certainly seeing that there are situations where that arise during their outings, that there are differences of opinion, and one of these things comes up when it has to do with a man by the name of Captain Foster. I was trying to look for a picture of the man. And Captain Foster happens to be another captain in the Navy, and his situation is such that um, they end up rescuing Captain Foster because his ship has unfortunately sunk. And for some reason, and I don't know whether it's based on this one incident that we encounter Captain Foster, or whether it's based on just in general what people know about Captain Foster. But apparently, there's some issue with his ethics. There is some kind of feeling that he may not be the most ethical individual out there, and that he has somewhat of a reckless nature to him. And the other captains really don't like it. The other officers don't like it. Um, I have to wonder, because we are presented with situations in the story where it's hard to understand. Um, Sometimes ships do get attacked by other ships, so this is not something that doesn't happen. But as soon as we realize that Captain Foster may or may not have been in charge of this ship that has supplies, or at least that's what I think they indicated or showed, and the ship has been sunk. Um, I think that people were really questioning his ability to lead and to be a good leader. So when the situation arises where they're sitting around the table after they rescue Foster and whoever may have survived the ship after it was under attack, the question about whether or not there were sailors who were rescued comes up at the table. And it's an uncomfortable question, Darth Plato. Why did things become so uncomfortable for Captain Foster, where he's defending himself after being rescued? Usually he'd get some time to maybe put things together, but he's really in a bad way, almost being judged. And it almost feels like he might be brought up under charges. What's going on here?
It looked like there may be some war profiteering going on. It's hard to say really what's going on, but it certainly looks that way. I mean, you see him killing another killing another man while in the water. Uh, so there definitely is something unbecoming going on. I think Pelu suspects that, but he realizes that Fosters are just going to come out and say it. Thing about those days is promotion, especially to captain, was entirely based on seniority rather than any sort of qualification. They didn't have a captain's exam like they have a lieutenant's exam. You had to pass the exam. The captaincy was simply based on whether there was an opening available and where you were on the list. If there was an opening, you got the position. I that there were naval officers at the time that wrote about this that thought that it should be changed, because sometimes you can have some very undesirable men rising to the captaincy or even into the admiralty. Yeah, I think we're seeing a taste of that in this episode right now.
Yeah, and this is a very good point that you make, and something to think about, because you certainly want a captain who knows how to handle a crew. And you were right. There is a scene in this episode where Captain Foster literally has to take a knife to one of the
Mhm.
sailors that's supposed to be his subordinate. And he almost has to threaten the rest of the sailors, do you want to, see the other edge of my knife? Um, and they kind of back down. But it was kind of uncomfortable because, they were literally holding on for their lives. And Foster's kind of hops out of the water and says, "Well, where's the ship? Where's my ship?" And they're like, "It's gone. It's been sunk." And he almost acts as if he can't believe it, but surely he must have questioned something going on um, while they were under attack. So it was a very odd kind of relationship, and it made me think that he didn't have a good relationship with the crew. And then when he boarded the Indefatigable, which rescued pretty much him and whatever Flotsam and Jefferson was in the water, even the officers there, with the exception of Hornblower, who is completely ignorant of what's going on, says, "Well, I'm kind of glad that our supplies didn't get into enemy hands."
Yeah, by enemy they mean the Spanish now, because the Spanish are now at war. They spent some time explaining at the beginning of the episode, so that Spain was neutral and that they were waiting to see what was going to happen. There was some concern that they were going to go to war. Turns out they did. Now, Spain, along with most of the other countries of Europe, had declared war on the revolutionary France because all the governments of Europe were scared to death of the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries openly declared that they were going to spread the revolution to other countries, and by spread the revolution, what they mean is the overthrow of the monarchies and stuff like that. And that wasn't going to fly in other countries. That's why you see this strong reaction in almost all of Europe declaring war on France. Spain was one of the first to do that. Now that was in 1793. By 1795, they had their fill of war, and there was a negotiation, the Second Treaty of Basel. And they became a non-combatant. The word neutral was used. Spain was not neutral in the same way, like say a Switzerland neutrality. It was more of a non-combatant. That might not have been the best word, but they did switch sides in 1796, and this was the beginning of what's called the Anglo-Spanish War, that's lasted until 1808, so about 12 years. It also set the stage for Trafalgar, which will happen several years from now. But right now, it's 1796. This is the opening. What we're seeing in this episode is the opening salvo of that long war, the uh, the war against Spain and France, um, Britain's war against Spain and France, I should say. Gibraltar is a major port of call for the Royal Navy. It's um, It's how they control shipping in and out of the Mediterranean. The Spanish don't like the fact that the British control Gibraltar. They've been controlling it since 1715, somewhere even a little before that. So they're eager to get back Gibraltar. That's what we're seeing in this episode. Is the Spanish are trying to starve out the British there, and that's really where the action of this episode is coming from.
And it is interesting, Doug Plato, as you say, talking about the fluctuations in these different, countries and how they interact with one another through the years. Oftentimes being allies and then being enemies. So, so there's
Oh
a
yeah.
lot of that going on. Um, but one thing that is going on the boat, which I imagine is pretty common, is the fact that since they don't have enough supplies to feed the sailors, they have to do this rationing, and it's extreme rationing at this point. We even see it's out of order, but we even see one of the captains, the captain of the Indefatigable, eating those round bread
Yeah,
things, which are
yeah,
not very
nasty,
palatable, but last a
nasty.
long time on the ship, and it's got maggots in it, and he
Mm.
taps out the maggots and he's eating that. Certainly, even the captain is rationing things out, and not enjoying this rationing. So the men on the ship are hungry. And honestly, it is kind of hard to watch. Some of them are actually collapsing because they don't have enough energy to do the work on the ship, which is arduous at times. They're moving heavy items sometimes and they have to raise those sails and climb. So you have to be kind of physical. It's not the kind of thing that you can't exercise, that you have to have or have the ability to do that. Um, and unfortunately, some of the sailors are succumbing to this. So we do see this, and I think that uh, eventually we see, sort of, so to speak, that one of the things that's very interesting about Horatio is being in charge of his men, his group, and having to deal with them complaining about the rationing. Now, I can completely understand that. Anybody would complain about rationing. You're not just going to say, "Oh yeah, I'm happy with it." There would
Mm.
be a lot of, I'm upset that we have to do this rationing. So
Sure, sure, but
Horatio finds himself in a situation where he has to work with the men and explain to them why they're having to do this rationing and keep things under control. But even he finds himself, in a situation where he can understand the plight of the.
uh-oh. Am I flying solo?
I'm sorry.
You kind of you spaced out for a second on my screen.
Okay. um, Especially when that one sailor collapses from hunger.
Mm.
And, it kind of forces the issue of, what happens as Horatio is supposed to be preparing for this exam. And time again throughout the episode, we keep seeing Horatio with his book. We keep seeing him be concerned about trying to prepare for this exam, only to be told that whatever's in this book maybe can't prepare you or won't be able to prepare you for a real life application. Um, in other words, these kind of practical situations are more valuable to a sailor and officer than anything found in a book. Why do they keep saying that? I mean, after all, this is in a book. We're reading the story is from a book. um, what do you think about their approach and this focus where everybody, the sailors and the officers, feel that the practical applications and experience seem to be more a better preparation for Horatio to take this exam than anything he finds in a book?
Well, I haven't read the book, but my understanding from someone that did read it says that this entire angle about what was Bunting, Mr. Bunting, was not included in the book. It was something they put in just for the TV version. So that's something that's different. The But you're right, rationing is something that does occur, and we see the reason why this is happening here is because of the Spanish are harassing the supplies coming out of Gibraltar. The camaraderie. Look, by this time, the camaraderie of war is so strong among the men of the ship that they're not going to buckle under. It's going to take a lot to get these men to buckle, and they're not going to buckle. And we see that here. And Hornblower is respected by his men, even though he does kind of tick them off a little bit at one point, try to tell them to keep quiet. Like having their games and their song and dance is something that men do at sea at that time because what else are they going to do? Just sit there and stare at the wall and lose their minds. So yeah, they're hungry. Everyone's hungry. They got to do something. So he wasn't being very considerate at that time, but he learned something that day. And that's what we see throughout this episode is just like the first episode is he's growing, he's learning, he's maturing. His relationship with his captain is more than just an officer and his captain. Mr. Pellew is actually becoming a father figure to Horatio, and perhaps even Horatio becoming a father figure for his men. Of course, he's not. He's younger than his men, so I guess there's not really their father figure, but. There is a respect there, even though he does irritate them at this point. What's the old saying? When the tough gets going, when the going is tough, the tough gets going.
Yeah, that is one of the sayings, and it's interesting because this character, as you said, was not in the book. It was added for dramatic effect, and of course, the basis, or at least part of the basis of his anger, let's say, with being in the situation. Well, obviously, yes, being hungry. No one likes to be hungry,
Yeah.
but we also learned that that sailor who collapsed was a very good friend of his. And
Yes.
when he passed away, this character Bunting, he kind of loses it a little bit. He's really, really freaked out by this. And that guy who passed away, and good morning to you, Tom Jr. Jackson. Um, uh, when he passes away, the situation really is that this may have been the only friend that this guy had, that Bunting had, in the scenario. And so, we see a very touching scene where they are committing that sailor's, I think it's Finch, his body to the ocean, because the burial is at sea.
Yeah, I'll see.
And after the burial takes place, Bunting is kind of selling his belongings, or doing stuff with the belongings. And I'm sorry, not Bunting, but let's just say, like, the person who's in charge of his belongings is selling them, and people are not offering decent prices. So Bunting decides to go ahead and buy what's there. And I'm guessing that might be sent to his family, whatever money is sent to his family. I'm not even quite sure what would happen, but he buys it and then throws it overboard.
Yeah.
Which is kind of silly. You're on a boat and everything is precious, so you're going to throw supplies that someone else could, use overboard. But he was just so frustrated with everything. But it kind of gets worse for this character, who unfortunately has a breakdown, more or less.
Yeah.
And Darth Plato, there's one really interesting scene in the story, and it might actually be this scene. Although I'm not entirely sure. Bunting is the character that's wearing the plaid, like a flannel plaid shirt, this great plaid shirt. And he ends up, Horatio ends up hearing him at some point during the show, that it's not fair that their rationing is taking place. And so Horatio kind of overhears Bunting speaking to the other sailors. And this type of stuff isn't supposed to be happening, where he's saying, well, I don't think what they're doing is right, and we need to stop them. Or it was kind of like, would be mutinous style type of talk
Right.
on the ship, below decks. And it just so happens that Horatio overhears this. Now, what I find interesting is, Horatio, because he understands that he's just lost a friend, and also that he's really hungry, decides to kind of overlook what has happened. But then we learn later that Horatio kind of regrets this, that
Yes.
he didn't say anything. And then unfortunately, Bunting breaks into the food reserves. A no. It's
Yeah.
essentially stealing food from everybody on the
That's,
ship. We've
that's right.
seen scenarios like this. And so the punishment is, Horatio fesses up with the captain and says, look, I've heard him saying mutinous talk before, but I didn't act on it. He could have flogged him, or cut more of his rations, or punished him for that. And the captain says, well, since you were the one who kind of let him go, and you dropped the ball, you have to lead him through the gauntlet. So I'm like, the
That's right.
gauntlet? It's a gauntlet. And it looks a lot like, it felt like a cross between a gang initiation and a blanket party to me, Darth Plato. What do you know about this gauntlet thing, and it as a form of punishment?
Corporal punishment has been around since ancient times. I mean, the Romans had a practice called decimation. Uh, this what we're seeing here. It really, I think, is a composite sketch of what situations that sailors would experience at sea. So, like I said, this wasn't in the book, but it is in the episode. So I think that's what the showrunners were trying to do, was to use this to use Mr. Bunting as a composite of men at sea that have it hard, and they suffer a break. He is literally suffering a break, and he's acting out, and it is harmful to the crew. And Mr. Hornblower, because he's a kind and gentle soul, wants to save everybody. He's at this point in his life where he's like, these are my men, and I'm willing to do anything for them, which is good. But he hasn't realized that some people you just can't save for whatever reason. That you can't save everybody. And Mr. Bunting is, it may be an extreme case, but he does go down this path where he is not going to be redeemed in the end. He is not. And and in this particular instance, Hornblower is forced to lead him through the gauntlet. In other words, by leading through the gauntlet, that is that he is facing Brenting the entire time, so he's watching what's going on the entire time. He's not just standing on the quarterdeck, watching, observing it. He's right there, leading him through the gun. So it's just as much a punishment for Hornblower almost it is as Bunting, even though he's not receiving the blows.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be on the ground or near that rowdy bunch of sailors while he's
Mm.
walking through that horrible, I called it a gang initiation or a blanket party. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be out there watching or holding my sword towards him. Unfortunately, Bunting does kind of prove to be very unstable. But we also learned something else about him, that he was pressed into service. And of course, you and I both
Right.
know being pressed into service means that I'm going to give one scenario. It's not the same scenario each time, but as a
That was very
child,
common.
you're
That was
forced to
very
become,
common in those days. It was
yes,
very
you kind of,
yes,
yes. And
and
you,
and they would do it to people from other countries. So it was not unusual to find people from other countries on a Royal Navy ship.
yes. And of course, you're forced into this military service, this naval service, and you have no choice but to stay there, because you are a sailor. So it's unfortunate that that happened to him, and he talks about that, or alludes to that, if I remember it correctly. That was a case, and that when he first came into the Navy, it was his friend Finch who kind of helped him deal
Yeah,
with everything. And
yeah.
so this was the only friend that he really had that helped him accept this type of life. But I think from the way that he behaved, he never truly accepted what had happened to him, and he wasn't ever going to get over what had happened to him. And I think that that's very important, because no one likes to be forced to become, like forced labor. That's what this, to me, it's like forced labor, but certainly it's not anything that anyone would want to do. So we also end up this getting this diplomat onto the boat by the name of
Mhm.
Mr. Tatling. And Mr.
Tattling.
Tatling is about, he's kind of like not somebody who, he wants the best accommodations on the ship. And he, is disgusted that he even has to go on the ship. There's so much about this whole thing that's a big bother to him. However, it's enjoyable to watch this character, because he's just so annoyed. He says something like, "Oh, you have to give me different accommodations on the ship." And Horatio says, "Well, you have the best accommodations. That's it. There's nothing else." And so later on, we see him where he says, "I absolutely, demand that you change my quarters and give me a better location." And it's
I
and it's
think I
hilarious, because he's just not ever going to understand that this is a ship, and you get what you get, and you just be grateful for it, right, Darth Plato?
yeah I think excuse me. I think that they put that scene deliberately in there just to illustrate that very point. I In reality, Mr. Tapling probably would have understood. He probably would have understood that it wasn't his first time out to sea, and I think they're just kind of putting that in there. Oh, here's this aristocratic guy who's kind of throwing his weight around and saying, "I deserve. I'm entitled to this. I'm entitled to that," and they're just trying to generate conflict for the episode. I think is what they're doing. I really doubt that Mr. Tapling would not understand. He probably would have understood that.
Yeah, and but it is enjoyable to watch.
Yeah, it
So
was.
soon we kind of find ourselves with him, and we notice that that he's going to be sort of this liaison to, and I'm assuming it might be somewhere off of Spain. I don't know where they are. Maybe North Africa. Who knows?
They went to Oran, which is today's Algeria, and in those days it was Ottoman Algiers. It was a protectorate of the Ottoman Empire. So, and by the way, this really conveys the risk what these men are experiencing, because they're not just at war with France and Spain; they're also in a very dangerous part of the world that's heavily trafficked by the Barbary pirates, who were also a big problem for people in those days. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong for these men.
All right. So I guess that might be North Africa, I think.
That says Algeria, yes, that's where they are.
And so, they're there, and obviously they're there to get supplies. And this is,
Yep.
things are getting very, very bad now, and they have to desperately get supplies. And you know, so the idea is that they're going to go and buy supplies here at this port. And at some point, this gentleman Bunting hops into one of the dinghies. I'm assuming it's a dinghy or whatever you want to call it.
A
To,
launch.
yeah, the launch to go ashore, but he's hidden underneath some of the sails or the covering, the canvas, and they don't know he's on that boat. So once they get to shore, Tattingly, addresses the emissary, the British emissary in Algeria, and the man comes out. But there are some questionable things that they notice as soon as they get to the port, and one of them is sort of like dead rats, or let's say I'm assuming it's dead rats right at the front of the port, and that's kind of disgusting. So they kind of walk around that, and the next thing you know, as the food is being brought out, the men who are bringing out the food start collapsing.
Yeah.
Darth Plato, they just start falling like flies, and suddenly they realize that it's a more serious situation than they initially thought. It's so serious that apparently there is disease there. They say plague, but let's just say it's some kind of disease.
There's the bubonic plague.
And people are affected by it. And, obviously this changes things dramatically. They thought they were going there for a quick pickup for supplies and food for
Yeah.
the ship. And now this has turned into something completely different, Darth Plato.
Yeah, as if something more, as if something else could go wrong.
Exactly. This one was major, and even I wondered what was going to happen in this particular case. And so they do end up getting the supplies, but Horatio has the unfortunate task of having to inform the captain and the other officers that they're not able to board the ship for 3 weeks because they're going to have to go into this quarantine that they've been exposed. And the captain says, okay, why don't you go ahead and spend time on that other ship? I think it's called the Carolina or whatever it's called. But now they have to quarantine themselves, Darth Plato. It's a quarantine ship.
It is, yeah.
So, it has me wondering a lot of things. Now they're on the ship, and this might have been a good time for things to kind of been patched up between Horatio and Bunting because they've got the food supplies, but things didn't go that way, Darth Plato. In fact, things went quite the opposite. And it made me wonder whether Bunting really was not ever going to be redeemable. And I think you did mention something about that, but we do have this very dramatic confrontation between Horatio and Bunting when Bunting kind of does, pulls a run for it. Did he have a chance of escaping and surviving in this foreign country at all, or was it really a death wish for him?
If he well, sure. If he had escaped, then he just says that he's a lone man in Algeria. Yeah, it's very very reasonable. He could have just became one of the Barbary pirates. There were English that fought for the Barbary pirates. They're shady characters all over the place. Man, their piracy. Yeah. Whether he thought that was ideal or not, who the hell knows what he thought? Who the hell knows what his background was? We don't know what kind of man he was before he was impressed. He could have been a criminal before this. It wasn't unusual. Look at press gangs. One of the things there's a number of things that they did, but one of the things that they did was they would go into the prisons and the jails, and they'd say, "Hey, who wants to be a sailor?" And that was a legitimate way to get men onto the to serve. I don't know how much they did that for the Navy, but they definitely did do that for the Army. The Army was even worse than the Navy because it was harder to get people to go into the Army than the Navy. There's a reason why this is, but we don't really have time to get into it. But press gangs. So another thing they would do is they would go into taverns and they would find people who were drunk, passed out, and they would just pick them up and carry them to the ship and dump them onto the ship. And when you come to, congratulations, you're now on the service.
Yeah, and that is kind of sad. And of course, there are some famous books. I think maybe there's this book called Kidnapped. It might be John Updike. I can't remember exactly, but a bunch of fantastic books that show this happening time and time again.
Fantastic books.
I'm sorry?
The fantastic books.
Um, okay, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know those books, but I do know,
Okay.
uh, yeah, I've heard some stories as well, Darth Plato, from other books that are like that and have those types of. It might be the Fantastic books, but I'm not sure. But
Okay.
um, yeah, it's something to think about. And the other part that I find really interesting about this is that Mr. Tattingly, that character, he ends up being given an assignment on the ship while they were in quarantine. And he says, "Well, I really can't do anything. Like, look at me. I can't even move. I can't function." And he's like, "Well, you're going to have to work in the kitchen." And it's like, it's hilarious seeing him there. But I
Mhm.
think it's interesting when the cook
Yeah,
swings.
especially in that day and age, because there really was um, a, this sense of snobbery, of class in those days. So so a man from the upper class, they didn't work with their hands. They didn't do servant work. This is the work of servants, and it was beneath them. So that's what he's doing. He's in the episode, and they're illustrating the fact that society in those days, where where men like this, men of privilege, where they would literally just sit there and die because they didn't know how to take care of themselves because they were always waited on by servants. And this man's like, "Oh my God, you want me to work with my hands?" And that's what you see in here.
Exactly. And I just love how the cook, or whatever, let's say maybe that's not the cook, maybe he has a few jobs on the ship, um, tells him, he says, "Well, if you're the cook, you get the main cuts."
That's true.
And which I think a lot of people like, picking to work in kitchens, regardless of where they are, you're going to get food, if anything else. And so all of a sudden he kind of changes his tune a little bit. But I really enjoyed the part where um, they also have livestock on board, which they acquired, by in the purchase of the supplies. And there isn't enough water, and they have to go and find fresh water for these animals. So they go
Yeah,
ashore, only to come back to find out that someone has kind of requisitioned some of their food
yeah,
supply.
that's Foster.
And it was Foster. And of all people, it felt very awkward, because no sooner had Horatio been kind of not defending, but understanding Foster's actions, and not going along with the reckless comments about him, that now he's kind of like, and I'm not going to say it's being stolen, but it feels like he had his stuff stolen from him, taken without authorization. And Horatio's like, "Oh, f that, let's go after them. We got to go after them." Like, they're like, "Yeah, we got to go after them." So it's like, it
Yeah,
felt, yes, it is military, but it felt very much like something that might happen in your neighborhood. Somebody takes your stuff, and you go, "We got to go get them. We got to get our stuff." So they go after them, and you can see, them in this launch, with a rack, and they've got the racks of the slaughtered animals on it. And then when it pulls up to the side of Foster's boat, what did you think about Foster's explanation and audacity of what he did, knowing that the supplies were for pretty much everyone?
well, first of all, allow me to take this moment to say hello to Tom Jr. is actually in the chat. It's nice to see you here. And whoever else may be watching, I can't really tell. Foster, okay. The first question I have for about Foster is, how in the world did he get another ship already? Who did he scam to get this ship? Okay, he's already back on the water. That couldn't have been that long. I seriously doubt that much, that he returned to England, made his report, and people at Whitehall looked it over and say, "Okay, well, here's your new ship. Get going." And now he's back, and now he's sailed all the way back down there again. No, I doubt very much that that's what happened. So he had to have taken that ship by force or something by somebody. So, yeah, if that's true, then does it really surprise us that he's going to scam Hornblower's people out of a side of beef? No.
Yeah, I think that if anything, Foster might be one of those people that when the apocalypse comes, he'll make it out because he'll do what he has to do in order to survive, so to speak.
War profiteering is a real thing.
And he, I also like the fact that Horatio tells him, well, you know something, what you've done, if you do this, you also have to take responsibility that you've done this.
Right.
You
And
know,
he, yeah, yeah.
well, I think that he has to say something to him because he certainly can't reprimand a superior officer, but he has to say something because Horatio was responsible for those supplies and money was paid for it. So it's different if they found it and it was, a bonus or something, but he has to explain, what's happened to it. So no sooner is Horatio back on the Indefatigable that he finds he has to take this exam. Now, this exam, is he really prepared for this exam, Darth Plato?
Well, look at this is I actually thinking about this question before we came on. Is there is no substitute for real world experience, and sure you can learn the class. You can learn a lot in the classroom. That's true, but real world experience is really there's nothing like it. It's the best thing you can do. You see this in Napoleon's own lifetime, where he was thrust into situations and he had to learn. He didn't go to school to learn a lot of what it was like for the upper ranks, and yet he he learned on the job and moved forward. Now that was true for a lot of. They didn't have formal military academies in those days. That didn't come about until the 1800s, and this is not the 1800s yet. So they did have a lieutenant's examination. That is so. We still do. It's a long standing tradition in the Navy, and and do I think he was ready for the classroom aspect of it? I have no idea. He may not have ever been in a classroom since he was a little kid, if he was ever in a classroom. He may have been homeschooled for all we know. I'm not. I don't know. Well, no, actually, they do say he was. He was. And they mentioned his education in the first episode. That's true. So he probably was somewhat comfortable with the classroom environment. But the lieutenant's examination isn't quite the same thing. But given his experience at school and his real world experience, I'd say don't bet against him. I'd say, yeah, he has a good chance.
Yes, certainly. And seeing him kind of, I don't even know what I would call it, scurry around to see if he can get the right hat and the borrowing, maybe everything he's wearing may be borrowed. Um, so he's dressed appropriately for this. And even then, he's probably not fully dressed right. But he
Mhm.
finds himself, I don't know whether it's Bridgeton or whatever port it is, Darth Plato, going to take this exam. And of course, outside of the exam room are all the other people who have to take this exam, and it's a little bleak, it's a little bleak. Everybody's got books and they're studying only for how surprised were you when Horatio walks in and only to find out that one of his examiners is Captain Foster?
I wasn't surprised. You just kind of roll your eyes and say figures. Honestly, I think a better question is how in the world did someone like Foster even get onto that board in the first place? Okay, if a man like Pelu was suspicious of Foster, then the other men would have as well.
Well,
So
I
that's
think
exactly the
I know
question.
the answer to the question about how did he get on the board and all this sort of stuff, and I think he's been following Horatio. And maybe he sees some potential in Horatio and he wants to get this guy on his ship. And I think the praise that Horatio has gotten from the other crew, from the crew, and some stories about him have made Foster interested. And Foster just happenstance happens to meet
Mhm.
Horatio and knows that Horatio thinks that it was better that the supplies did, those other guys didn't get the supplies, and he maybe feels that Horatio might even somewhat favor him a bit or the way that he operates, only to have this huge misstep with taking the food from him for whatever reason. Maybe he was hungry. Who knows the prophet you mentioned? But certainly not anything you want to do to sway somebody over to your side. So by being on his committee, Foster would have had a huge influence over whether Horatio would have passed the exam. And perhaps, although I don't believe it would be true, Horatio might feel indebted to Foster if Foster was the person who had said, "Hey, you know what? I know Horatio tried his best, but he didn't pass, but I think we should give him a second chance. He shouldn't do another 6 months as a midshipman.
It's
Let's give him
possible.
this." That's what I was thinking might be the case, because this Foster seems to work so many angles, Darth Plato, so many
Yeah.
angles in what he's doing. And of course, the biggest surprise of all, is pretty much the climax of this story. You would think that we'd already hit it already, but for me, this is so exciting. Horatio's sitting there. He's answering his question. He has no idea what the answer is. He doesn't know. And you hear these bombs going off right when he's in the middle of this exam. Horatio, what luck does Horatio have, Darth Plato, when you're failing this exam and pretty much a major attack comes into your town, stopping the exam?
Well,
Oh my gosh. What is Horatio thinking when this happens?
well, let me say first that I can't gainsay your theory about Foster wanting to be at the trial because he's interested in Hornblower. That's not outside the realm of possibility. I'm not convinced that that's really what's going on there. Um, as far as the drama, the drama, look at, I like the first episode better than the episode that we're reviewing now. This is not one of the episodes that I really like. There are aspects of it that I do like, but this isn't the one that I really rate very highly for what I like. And part of the reason is because of the last scene that we're seeing here. The scene that we're talking about is where the Spanish fire ship shows up in the English harbor. No, there's no way that would happen at this time. The English naval superiority is pretty formidable at this point. The It could be that this scene is contrived from a what was it called? I don't recall the name off the top of my head, but there about 100 years earlier there was a Danish, not Danish. Who did that? It was the Dutch. Yeah, it was the Dutch. Yeah, the Dutch launched a raid into one of the harbors near Kent, and it was a fire ship attack. And this prompted the English to more thoroughly cable the harbor so that you couldn't just readily sail it. A few weeks ago, you did a show with Cameron Pasha about Constantinople and how there was a big chain and you couldn't just sail in because there was a chain there. Well, English harbors were pretty well protected likewise. You couldn't just sail in. By the time we're talking about this episode, so 1796, that absolutely would have been the case. There would have been a chain, so you couldn't just sail in there. So there's no way a talk like this could have taken place, especially at a place like Plymouth, which I think is where they are. I think they're at Plymouth. That's like the HQ of the Royal Navy. You can't just sail into that place at this point in time. Maybe 100 years ago, yeah, sure, maybe, but not now. So that entire scene is entirely forced and entirely fictional. So I didn't like it myself because it was just so contrived. But I appreciate the translation to the television medium of what they're trying to do, and I might have done the same thing, sure. So I understand why the audience would look at this and say it was a good scene, and drama wise, it was a good scene. It just wasn't historically very realistic.
Well, in the scene, and you did mention what happens with this fire ship that wanders into the port,
Mm.
with the British ships kind of just there,
Yes.
and they're very vulnerable. And this fire ship comes along, and somehow the captains, of course, everybody's racing on these launches to get to their ships to see what they can do to address this issue. And somehow Horatio forces himself onto the launch, and he's on the boat with some of the other officers, including Foster.
Yep.
And somehow Horatio, says, "Hey, that's the Indefatigable. That fire ship is going directly to the Indefatigable. We got to stop it. We got to do something." And so, I think it's very interesting because I don't think anybody was going to do anything to try and stop that ship. And I guess Horatio felt that you could board it and stop it. How come Foster got embroiled in this? I thought Foster was being very cheeky, very standoffish to Horatio during the exam period, and now they're jumping on a boat that's in flames. How did
Mhm.
this happen, Darth Plato?
I guess he was just a gutsy guy. Look at just because someone's sleazy when and looking out for personal gain doesn't mean they weren't courageous. A good example of that was Sir Francis Drake. He was a very sleazy, very piratical guy, but he was enormously brave. So I don't know. Maybe he is based on Sir Francis Drake. He could be. It doesn't. I don't think it should necessarily surprise us that a character like Foster would actually do that. It doesn't necessarily surprise me.
Well, it certainly was amazing to watch the
Yeah,
sequence of events, and of course,
yeah.
there always has
It was a good drama. Yes.
yes, and there always has to be a point where someone is going to die and they say, go without me, save yourself. And then the person says, no, I'm going to save you, and of course, Horatio does this,
Yeah.
throws him into the water very dramatically. And I started
Yeah.
to wonder to myself, I almost started to think that maybe Foster might be the most typical type of individual who would be an officer in the Navy at that time, because the decisions that are being made, they're constantly under scrutiny of how they make decisions in the Navy.
Yes, but
And depending upon, I
like
mean, what do you think, Darth
it
Vader?
doesn't. But yes, but what matters the most is seniority. What matters the most is seniority. If a spot is open, he's gonna get it. That's just how it is. He'll probably make it into the Admiralty. If this spot is open, he'll get in. It wasn't. They didn't really have. There really wasn't an apparatus where you could just sack someone very easily. I'm sure there was a precedent for it, but you'd have to do something really beyond the pale. I don't know what that would be off the top of my head, but yeah, someone like Foster is yeah. There's really no way to get like. There's John Jervis, who was a very well-known admiral at the time. He wrote about this. He wrote about a man. His name was Captain Knowles, and he said that this man has no business being in the Royal Navy, and he's going to get promoted to the Admiralty because his name is on the list, and he thought that the entire list system needed to be completely upended and redone, so to prevent men like Knowles from being promoted, and he was frustrated by it because there was nothing he could do to stop it, even though he was one of the highest ranking admirals in the Navy at the time. So there really wasn't anything you could do about Foster. There really wasn't, and short of defecting to the enemy, there really wasn't anything you could do.
And what was the final outcome? Because when Horatio is back on the Indefatigable speaking to his captain, the captain talks about how Horatio was failing the exam. Like he wasn't able to even answer any of the questions or get anything going. Where is Horatio right now in the series, as in regards to his ranking and this examination?
His what examination?
Where does Horatio stand in regards to his ranking and this
Oh,
examination? What is the status for him for this entire thing?
I believe I'm not sure if he passed the examination. I think it was just delayed for a future date. And I think we just assumed that he passed it at a later date. But yeah, he does remain a lieutenant, which means he's not going back to midshipman, which means he's keeping his pay, and which is probably the biggest, probably at the time, is a really big deal. It's a big difference in the pay. Obviously, his responsibilities are different. The higher rank you are, the greater your responsibilities are. So yes, this is definitely a good step in his career. It, the entire battle was very, if you want to call it a battle, was very advantageous for Horatio. It helped. It worked out for him.
It was an opportunity, and we do see that in Horatio. And there's nothing more satisfying than seeing Horatio on that fire ship with Foster together, and they're looking at the captain, who, as we know, doesn't care for Foster, but clearly. he can see that Horatio and Foster are doing everything they can to spare the Indefatigable from, destruction. So it's almost as if he's stupefied at that point. There's not very much he can say at this point, after seeing actions like this. And it really is amazing to watch the look on his face. Of course, the guy who plays Foster is Wedge,
Mhm.
from Star Wars, I think.
And
Um,
just to make a clarification,
yes.
the lieutenant's examination it's not an exam where you go into a class like we've all been to school. It's not like you go into your class and you have your blue notebook and you have your number two pencil and you put everything on the floor. It's you go in there, you sit down, and you have a panel of three men, in this case admirals or captains, I guess it would be in this case, and it's called a viva voca examination. It's an oral examination. The term for it was viva voca. That's what the term that they used. Rodney Dangerfield humorously referred to it as an oral examination. Well, that's exactly what it is, though not quite as suggestive as Dangerfield may have implied. But that is what is going on. He's not. There's no writing involved. I'm sure he had a notepad and paper. I'm sure, but that's what he's doing. He's sitting there and talking, and they're talking to each other. What would you do in this situation? Oh, well, sir, this is what I would do. And another thing, just I don't remember where I read this, but during the lieutenant's examination, when they open the door and the candidate walks in, there was something hanging from the ceiling, and if you were too tall and you had to stand under it, if you were too tall, they would look at that and they would just march you right off. So thank you, come this way, and then they go through the door, they close the door, and you were not given an explanation. The examination was over, and you were never asked a question. What's going on there was if you were too tall, they wouldn't want you in. They don't want you because they don't want men who are too tall. Because the ships in those days, the rigging were like yay high. So if you were too tall, you had to duck underneath all the time. Some sort of mishap will happen because you're too tall. Men weren't tall in those days. Nelson was a very short man. The men in the Navy were very short. So if you were too tall, you would get bounced. And also during the scene with the fire ship on the Indefatigable, you have the men with the long poles. They had the long pole they were trying to push. That was a known tactic at the time for trying to stave off a fire ship, just to push the other ship away. And that was something that they really did in those days.
Well, they certainly did a good job of demonstrating it, and that fire looked incredibly deadly. People had burns
Mhm.
that night from all that fire. It was an intense fire. It was very strong. And inevitably, I guess, for Horatio, things did work out because now he kind of did this action that would work in his favor, certainly showing that he cares about what happens to his ship, but also no one asked him to do that. So he did it on his own volition, which I also thought was very interesting. But
Well, yeah, and that's the real trial for the examination. Really, I think that it's not the classroom itself. The entire episode is a trial. His struggling with the bunting, struggling with his crew, struggling to find food and water, and fighting the Spanish at that one engagement on land. Um, Fighting with his captain over Foster. It's like, do I say anything or what do I say? The scene early in the beginning where Foster asked him a question and Hornblower doesn't know what to say. Like, oh, I don't want to say the wrong thing, so I'll say something flattering. The entire episode is the trial. That is the real trial of Hornblower's episodes, not the scene where he's going in there with these other men waiting to be picked apart by these captains in an oral examination.
absolutely, Darth Plato. Do you have any final thoughts on this fantastic episode of a Horatio Hornblower, Lieutenant's Examination?
It's not one of my favorite episodes of the Hornblower series, but it is a good episode overall. The entire series overall is really good, and I'm disappointed that they cut it as short as they did.
Okay. Well, I enjoyed the episode. And I think that this story, the way that they're presenting it with Horatio, it's getting better and better. I can see why this series was so popular for a lot of people who may never have watched it, and this is the first time you are watching it.
Yeah.
Please do let us know what you think if you come back onto the stream and make comments about it. It's absolutely enjoyable. And a lot of fun to watch. I think they did a good job of adapting the novels, even though it's not exact. I do get a sense of what it must have been like for these sailors.
True.
Darth Plato, where can
Yeah.
people find you?
Oh, I'm around. You can find me. Well, most notably on the PGS and right here on the Positive Fandom.
Well, guys, you can find me here on Positive Fandom, my YouTube channel, where tonight I am going to be hosting a The Last of Us watch party because it's going to be shown a little bit earlier than usual. It'll actually be shown on Sunday too, but that is the Super Bowl. So there won't be a lot of streaming, I think, during that time for network TV. But yes, you can find me here on Positive Fandom. You can also find me on the Burn Network, as well as Lorena Creel's channel, and sometimes the 1/6 Scale Man Network. So please do check me out on those channels there. And I do want to thank you, Darth Plato, for taking the time to do this stream today. I just so enjoy talking about Horatio Hornblower. This is one of my favorite series, and it's been wonderful.
You're very
And
welcome.
for yes, thank you. And for all of you out there, no matter where you are in the galaxy, always do remember to please be kind. We got Star Trek Picard coming up soon, guys. Take care, everybody.